All right, so chapter 18, it talks about cities, immigrants, and the nation. We're going back to 1880 and we're going to move forward all the way to 1914 with this chapter. So in this chapter, there's three major areas of discussion. We're going to start off talking about a new wave of immigrants. And the second section is entitled Becoming an Urban Nation. And finally, we're going to end with urban politics at the turn of the century. So the immigration trend in the late 19th century, it was global. It's not like people are just coming to the United States. Europeans landed in places like Canada, Argentina, Brazil, and Cuba, while Asians migrated, throughout all of Asia and the Pacific, and British and Irish migrants moved throughout the British Empire. And some of the reasons for migration included land and job opportunities, though most immigrants moved voluntarily. Some Chinese, Mexican, Italian, and other workers moved throughout the world bound by labor contracts. So we have some different push and pull factors. And so a push factor would be, if there's a war or certain turmoil going on in your country, it's going to push you out of your homeland. Pull factors would be jobs, new opportunities, more land available in different areas that will pull you into new countries. So the immigrants to the United States in this era came from new regions, particularly Southern and Eastern Europe. Immigrants, many of whom were Catholic and Jewish, entered an entirely new cultural setting with little knowledge of English. Most were poor and worked hard to take advantage of the opportunities presented by a new country. Between 1860 and 1924, some 450,000 Mexican workers immigrated to the United States and got jobs in southwestern mines, mills, and construction sites. People from Cuba, the Bahamas, and even from Spain moved to Florida to work in cigar factories, and Japanese migrants moved to West Coast states, often coming in via Hawaii before they hit the western coast of the United States. Just to give you an idea of some of the things that were happening, I love this picture. So these are Angel Island, people coming in via Angel Island and they're having their physical exam done. So because we've enacted quotas at this point in US history, we only take so many Japanese per year, we only take so many Chinese per year. What these physical exams do is they measure the physical traits, but also the mental traits, and those that are deemed unworthy or unfit are actually denied entry into the country. So by 1910, one-third of the U.S. population was foreign-born or was first-generation American. And immigrants made up the vast majority of the population of our large cities like New York, Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Minneapolis, and San Francisco. Immigrants typically have political, religious, or economic reasons for moving to the United States, and almost all were poor. U.S. railroad and steamship companies capitalize on this by emphasizing American economic opportunities in their European advertising. So, right, trying to pull those poor people out of their country by offering them better jobs, better opportunities. Many immigrants did not consider coming to the United States really permanently. They thought just temporarily go make some money and then move back. More than a third of those who arrived between 1875 and 1919 returned home exactly like what I just said after making enough money to establish a better lifestyle back home. Those who did stay included Jews, Mexicans, the Czechs, and Japanese, and they had often been the victims of religious or political persecution back home, so why go back and suffer that again? Might as well just stay. Immigrants typically settled in neighborhoods with others from their home countries, forming ghettos, or neighborhoods that were nearly monolithic in their ethnic, racial, or class composition. Think of places like Chinatown or Little Italy. Communities helped new immigrants settle and adjust. Mutual aid societies provided assistance to immigrants in paying for insurance and other funerals, and social centers offered immigrants who shared a common heritage the opportunity to be able to play games with each other and talk and relax together. For the Chinese in California, mutual aid societies and social centers were often composed of people from the same towns and villages in China, and within these centers, immigrants helped each other find jobs, mediate conflict, fight discrimination, and celebrate their Chinese culture. Ethnic ties were strong in communities throughout the country, and each immigrant group established organizations and centers that served its community's unique economic, educational, social, and cultural needs. Religion provided another important outlet for immigrants, and in the last 35 years of the 19th century, the number of Catholic churches in the United States more than tripled. Churches provided more than simply a religious outlet. They offered clothing, food, and support to the struggling. They also were instrumental in organizing social and cultural opportunities for the community at large. And also, they kept detailed records for the major life events of their parishioners. And just to give you an idea, immigrants, foreign born and children of foreign or mixed patronage by country, just break it up a little bit. You can see just the difference throughout the country. Religion itself changed to fit the new environment as ethnic groups worked to reshape the Catholic Church in the United States to meet their own needs by celebrating patron saints from towns in the Old World, having distinct priests and parishes for each ethnic group, and making other changes that controlled with Vatican policies. Religious practice varied for Jews in the United States. Reform Judaism, founded in Cincinnati, Ohio, relaxed strict standards of worship, but other Jews maintained their commitment to traditional Orthodox practices. Local newspapers in foreign languages provided the residents of ethnic enclaves with an opportunity to keep attuned to local, national, and international events. Between the mid-1880s and 1920, some 3,500 new foreign language newspapers began publication. The prevalence of poverty in immigrant communities established a firm foundation for petty crime, gangs, and ethnic clashes, as well as organized crime groups connected to international syndicates. Poverty, tight living quarters, and family problems shaped immigrant experiences as well, with husbands earning a reputation for drunkenness and abusiveness, boarders posing the threat of unwanted sexual advances to the women of the house, and different generations within families clashing with each other over the conflicting expectations for American life. Mutual aid societies and social organizations not only helped ease some of the bureaucratic and structural problems facing immigrants in the United States, but it also helped immigrant families navigate problems within the household as well. So just an example, this is of an area which had a lot of Polish immigrants, and this is like a Polish saloon. These are just kids playing right here. At first it looks like there's a fight going on, but they're just playing on the street. So the U.S. rhetoric really, talked about how the nation was a welcoming place for newcomers. Americans whose families had been in the country for a longer period of time were really dismayed by the new influx. Industrialists viewed immigrants as a cheap, exploitable labor source, which bred contempt of older industrial workers, and small pockets of radicalism within the large wave of immigrants fed to anxieties about anti-American sentiment. Anti-immigrant sentiment was not new. Laws and standards throughout U.S. history defined citizenship as being available to whites, and over the course of the 19th century, efforts to define whiteness really shaped national discourse around citizenship. Racial categorization had become a science in this era, and the science of race influenced politics. At this time, many believed that Southern European immigrants were a threat to the capacity for self-government in the United States because criminality, laziness, drunkenness, greed, and thrift had all been, traits that were not born of social circumstance, but were inborn and unchangeable ethnic character traits. So a lot of hate at this point, like to Italians, to Greeks, to Jews, and other groups that were coming. A lot of this was stereotypes that had been bred a long time ago and just kind of overarching stereotypes leading to this point in history. Scientific racial divisions fed labor strife as skilled workers who hoped to keep their wages high felt threatened by unskilled workers. Tensions in neighborhoods were heightened as middle-class residents blamed urban strife on immigrants, and Protestants began to feel that their superiority was in jeopardy as Catholics and Jews grew to be an increasingly significant portion of the population. And nativist sentiment, which blamed foreigners for all the threats, dangers, and problems prevalent in American culture, that really escalated in response to the influx of immigrants and shaped political and social discourse. We all know immigrants are not the issue. There were already problems, there was already crime, there was all that going on before these new immigrants came over. But it seems like the immigrants are blamed for a lot of American problems, which, yes, they do add to it, but not all immigrants are bad, just like not all Americans are bad. So, but at this time, this nativist sentiment, and also like border control, that's still an issue today. This was all the same thing that was happening in the 1800s as well. So in 1893, Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge and other like-minded individuals, they formed the Immigration Restriction League. And that league pushed for the exclusion of illiterate adult immigrants. The American Protective Association, which had formed in 1887, they hoped to restrict Catholic immigration as well as the political and economic opportunities available to Catholics when they arrived in the United States. Nativists were interested in the idea of eugenics, a form of biological engineering that sought to reproduce only desirable races. Eugenicists encouraged the sterilization of those who were seen as unfit to reproduce and lobbied for marriage restrictions, and those restrictions would lead to the reproduction only of desirable individuals. Starting to sound a lot like what happened to Germany under the Nazi regime, breeding only the fit, desirable group, doesn't it? So some reformers advocated for assimilation of immigrants just as they had for Native Americans and encouraged American-style dress, grooming, and education, and the observance of cultural traditions like the celebration of Columbus Day and Thanksgiving. And in 1892, Francis Bellamy's Pledge of Allegiance was adopted as a ritual in public schools. But first-generation immigrants, they really struggled to assimilate, but did change significantly as they adapted to certain aspects of American life, and this influenced their desire to ensure that their children would become full-fledged Americans. In 1908, Israel Zangwill wrote the play The Melting Pot, which illustrated immigrants' goals of mixing together in the United States and becoming equal to native-born Americans. The play created a notion of life in the United States that has persisted in American cultural expression. The notion of a melting pot was more idealistic than realistic. However, as immigrants continued to embrace certain aspects of their culture, and many Americans resisted the notion that immigrants could assimilate at all. For African Americans, the idea of assimilation presented an important predicament. W. E. B. Du Bois expressed the difficulty in his 1903 work, The Souls of Black Folk, in which he argued that African Americans felt a sense of a two-ness or a double consciousness because of their inability to reconcile their African heritage with their history as slaves and free people in America. We'll talk more about this double consciousness as we talk more about the civil rights movement later on in the semester. The idea of the melting pot gave way to a more realistic image of vegetable soup in which different elements coexisted in the same context. All right, we're going to move on to the next section, becoming an urban nation, and we're going to start off talking about the new industrial city. So many Americans believe that the true spirit and identity of the country lay in the prominence of small, independent farms. The shift to increase urbanization left many concerned over the future of the country. Like immigration, migration within countries was an international trend. Between 1820 and 1920, about 60 million people worldwide moved from rural country areas to urban or city areas. Over the course of the 19th century, the expansion of transportation and communication networks facilitated the growth of American cities, transforming metropolises like Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Detroit into important centers for trade and commerce. Migration from farms to industrial centers also contributed to the growth of cities, as people sought refuge from the isolation of rural areas and better economic opportunities than those presented by an agricultural lifestyle. As they were industrialized, cities began to use electricity in order to expand nighttime entertainment. Also, you could work through the night with electricity as well. They developed streetcars to transport people, improved their water and sewage systems. They constructed higher buildings and saw vast advances in urban public health over the last part of the century. Many of the same causes of urbanization in the the Northeast and the Midwest, spurred growth in the West as well. Cities began to emerge along railroad terminals, and a great number of people began migrating to the cities in the West. Women also began moving to the cities as mechanization on farms made their labor less significant. At the same time, women's work as homemakers became simpler and more streamlined as mail order houses such as Sears, Roebuck offered manufactured goods that women would otherwise have had to make themselves. Blacks migrated to cities as well, trying to escape poverty and discrimination and racial violence in the rural South, and contributing to a dramatic rise in the African American population of southern cities. Black migrants found that their opportunities in cities were limited, though, so they were trying to escape discrimination, only to turn around and find it in the cities. For instance, many blacks found work as janitors or domestic servants, but jobs in certain industries, such as cotton mills, were completely off limits to them. For some, blacks moving to the cities offered opportunities to start independent businesses, including funeral parlors, barber shops, or construction companies, and other blacks became professionals who served their own communities. After 1900, blacks increasingly left the rural South for northern cities, where they hoped to find better opportunities for jobs and freedom from confines of Southern segregation. In spite of their hope of escaping segregation, blacks who migrated to northern cities found that discrimination there took on different forms, including job restrictions and residential segregation, which fostered the creation of African American ghettos. African American efforts to thrive in the face of discrimination fueled the creation of a black middle class that amassed significant wealth, published newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender, and created mutual aid societies, lodges, and also women's clubs. Religious institutions in black communities served social and political functions as well, promoting freedom from white oppression, fostering middle class notions of respectability, and at times creating conflict between various classes of worshipers. We're going to move on and talk about just the cities themselves. So cities grew to accommodate increasing populations, expanding vertically and horizontally. Property values reflected the growth of cities. In Chicago, for example, the value of one piece of property increased from $160 to $800 during the 1870s and 1880s. In New York City, one lot's value increased tenfold in just 40 years. In response, builders first developed cloud scrapers, or 10-story buildings that were built with cast iron columns, and then skyscrapers, which utilized steel and elevators and stretched as much as 30 stories. Horizontal expansion also was accompanied by transportation innovations, and by 1914, walking cities had become riding cities, meaning they had spread out so far and gotten so large that you couldn't walk quickly, like from one side of the city to the next. You actually had to use like some sort of transportation in order to get from one part of the city to the next in a limited amount of time. Electric trolleys first appeared in Richmond, Virginia, and electricity made it possible for subways to provide commuters with the opportunity to ride underground without the pollution of a steam engine. Boston's subway system opened in 1897, and then New York, their subway system opened in 1904. So Boston was the first to have a subway system. Bridges also allowed for cities to expand outward, and with the completion in 1883 of the 13-year project to build the Brooklyn Bridge, came to represent urban growth. Transportation improvements also fostered the growth of suburbs in the late 19th century, as many members of the middle class who were eager to escape social problems that accompanied poor immigrants, they sought out open spaces for their families and so started moving further and further away from the center of the city. However, we're going to look at how the other half lived. And with the flight of those middle class into the suburbs, poor and working class immigrants crowded into urban apartments, increasing the population density dramatically and creating conditions for public health problems. Immigrant neighborhoods deteriorated from overcrowding as immigrants crowded into multiple family apartment buildings called tenements that often lacked plumbing and heating. So imagine 100 people living in a small building. You have no indoor plumbing, you have no indoor water, you probably don't even have electricity. So guess what? They all have to share like one public outhouse, probably, maybe even with other buildings. It's just gross. So legal reforms in New York led to the construction of narrow 5 and 6 story buildings that were dark, damp, poorly ventilated, and hazardous. The dangers of overcrowding in tenement life were real as fires spread quickly. In 1871, the north side of Chicago burned to the ground, and Boston and Baltimore suffered devastating fires as well. Then there was an earthquake in San Francisco in 1906. It ended up sparking a fire that killed 1,500 people, and also, I mean, just imagine it's going to destroy a vast amount of property. Though fires were a serious danger, they also do provide cities the opportunity to rebuild and make it better. So Chicago's skyline and its system of parks were built after fire had cleared the land. Jacob Riis, he created this book and it was entitled How the Other Half Lives. And in it, he also uses pictures. It's not just a whole bunch of writing, it's pictures and it's a visual book as well. And it highlighted the dangerous, inadequate, and difficult conditions in tenements and offered a foundation for critiquing the tenement system, which spread to cities like Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Boston in spite of how poor life um, tenement was. Tenements were not just residences, though. Czech immigrants made cigars in their apartments, and garment makers hired laborers to work in tenement sweatshops, paying them per piece rate. In 1911, a fire broke out on the 8th story of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, in which underpaid and exploited Jewish and Italian clothing workers toiled. Fire engine ladders were unable to reach the trapped workers, and on the 9th floor an exit door was locked to prevent theft. The fire resulted in the deaths of 140 people, some of whom had attempted to escape the fire by jumping out of the factory's upper story windows. And here's a picture. This is the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire that we just talked about. Most of those were women who were working on the 8th and 9th floor. And as it said, they couldn't get like out to the stairs because they don't have elevators in this building. They couldn't get out to the stairs in time to make it down. The stairs were blocked. And also the fire escape, it had been locked shut because they were trying to prevent theft. And so all the exits essentially were either locked or blocked. The only way for these women and workers to try to escape, because the fire ladders couldn't reach up past the 3rd story, were for them to try to jump to, and most of them are going to end up jumping to their death. So these are the women laying in the coffins, and this is the public that was allowed to come and um, view the coffins and view the women before they were buried. Disease also flourished in tenement neighborhoods. Cholera, typhoid, yellow fever, and tuberculosis ended up killing tens of thousands of slum dwellers whose ability to fight infections was compromised by their poor diet and just close living quarters. Waste elimination also, that was a significant contributor to the spread of disease, with many as 800 people using a single outdoor public toilet and cities dumping human waste into rivers that also supplied drinking water. So gross. Other city problems included poor streets and traffic problems. Pollution, litter, crowds, and horse manure, along with gravel and sand streets, made moving about the city difficult, and only small cities such as New Haven and Connecticut were really able to afford to pave their streets. Of course, crime is prevalent, right? In poor neighborhoods, you're going to have more crime. And the U.S. murder rate quadrupled between 1880 and 1900. Neighborhoods in New York City adopted nicknames that reflected the rise in crime, such as Hell's Kitchen and Bandits Roost, and others were home to gangs like the Sewer Rats and the Rock Gang. Prostitution and theft proliferated, and urban police departments were formed in response to all of this. You're also going to have, we're going to talk about urban politics at the turn of the century now, and we're going to see how um, politics and the need for change came about. Part of it is in response to all this crime and just the poor neighborhoods that's going on. So as cities expanded in the age of industrialization, municipal politics needed to change in order to address the problems that emerged. For example, in Chicago before the turn of the century, city government was in conflict with itself and it ended up being very ineffective. Politicians formed political machines to address some of these problems by centralizing power and elevating bosses to positions of control, from which they reigned in authority and served the needs of specific constituents. Immigrants were the key source for support of the political machines, which provided assistance and um, helped in tenement communities. And what they would do, they would go to these poor communities and they would offer turkeys on holidays. They would give coal for heat. They would help you find jobs. They would give shelter. They would offer legal assistance, entertainment, and also celebrations. But all that was done in order for you to really obey this political boss. And then also, when it came time to voting, you would vote how they told you to vote in exchange for these benefits, these perks. Political machines offered assistance to businessmen as well, removing red tape and other barriers to licenses and facilitating the growth of vice, prostitution, and gambling in exchange for a portion of their profits. Here's a picture of one of those bosses. You can kind of see all the henchmen behind him. And we're going to talk about one of probably the most famous political Boss Tweed, in just a second. But by providing assistance and services, these political machines ensured that they would have the support of voters in the communities that they served. The machines readily engaged in corrupt election practices to maintain their power in the face of political challenges, using tactics like the graveyard vote, in which bosses padded voter rolls with the names of the deceased, and repeaters, or people who voted under more than one name. So there's this really great example if you've ever seen the movie The Gangs of New York, or it's voting day, and they go out and they have like all these people fresh off the boat. They have them go and vote, and then they have them go and like shave their beards or get a haircut and go vote again. It's a lot of voter fraud. Boss William Marcy Tweed of Tammany Hall, he's in New York, he became the symbol of corruption and political machines. And he ends up swindling the city out of a fortune before eventually going to jail on fraud charges. Other political bosses argued that graft and corruption were necessary while disavowing the dishonest graft practiced by Tweed. Though political machines served as a purpose for poor immigrant constituents, corruption fed into higher tax rates for the middle class, and neither dramatically improved conditions, and they don't really alleviate the conditions that were um, cause social problems for the working class. So we see from that, we're going to see the political bosses, those political machines slowly dying out when we have reform movements. And these urban reformers really included the wealthy and middle class men and women. They fought political machines by advocating that they be replaced by civil service. So they pushed Congress to pass the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883, and that required that federal jobs be awarded on the basis of merit rather than through your political connections. Some reformers hoped to change the circumstances under which immigrants struggled by immersing themselves in the community and establishing settlement houses, which offered counseling sessions. They offer classes, playgrounds for children, and meeting spaces for community members. Settlement house organizations took this approach after noting that immigrants turned to political machines and taverns because those institutions alleviated their suffering and offered social and political support by offering solutions and services from within the community. So settlement house workers hoped to function as an alternative to that. By 1900, there were roughly 100 settlement houses in the United States. Probably the most famous one in the U.S. is going to be Chicago's Hull House. Many reformers were inspired by religion and used faith as a foundation for social uplift, arguing that environmental circumstances influence the dysfunctional nature of immigrant communities. Among the religious reformers was Washington Gladden, who believed that private enterprise fostered inequality and who promoted the idea of a social gospel, which merged Christian beliefs with support for civil service reform and political change. Most reform efforts, though, they're only going to scratch the surface of fixing social problems in communities, in part because most reformers were not able to fundamentally change the structure and institutions that created this perpetuated poverty. So the next chapter, chapter 19, when we get into that chapter, it's talking about progressivism, and we're going to look at the progressives and the reforms that they try to bring to try to help alleviate, urban poverty, social ills that are happening, and crime rates. And we're going to look at the different reforms, essentially, that they try to put into practice. And so, you know, only scratching the surface here, but we're going to try to see some political changes that happen and some big movements that happen in chapter 19 to try to address all of these different issues that we've talked about in chapter 18.